listening to me at this moment likely indicates that you are a person interested in developing your spiritual life, if even only to a small degree. Most likely you're a person looking for further guidance in the life of prayer, searching for even greater clarity regarding how to live a truly spiritual life. Since this is likely true, then I hope that you will walk with me on this journey, and in so doing, my prayer is that you find what you encounter here to be at least a springboard, a boost toward living the life that has secretly resided in your soul. May you find here that springboard from which to launch out on the wondrous journey and adventure of watchfulness and prayer, and endeavor to place a foot across the threshold of the thin place between the overt world of the senses and the inner, often seemingly elusive world of the kingdom of God. To begin with, we need to address the matters of what prayer, watchfulness, and the spiritual life happen to be. We need to converse with such ponderings as, how do I live a spiritual life in the midst of such a demanding world? How am I to pray? What does it mean even to be spiritual? And what actually is prayer? Certainly the answers to these questions have filled numerous books, lectures, sermons, discussions, and they certainly will continue to do so. Why so many books? Why so many answers necessary? The mere number of books makes it obvious that in some manner or another the answers presented must not have been fully satisfying to the hearers. If they had been satisfactory, then only a few truly good books would be sufficient to fill the void. This is not to imply that these books and teachings are in some manner wrong. Even though a great number of these explanations are lacking in depth, it is probably not the fault of the authors that leads to this proliferation, to the constant demand for another answer. There may be a more profound reason. The deeper reason may be that for many of us, to truly grasp the meaning of prayer, it will compel us toward the complete transformation of our life. And many of us do not want such a dramatic transformation. Isaiah said as much, and Jesus quotes him saying, "Hearing, they do not hear, and seeing, they do not see. They do not want to hear and see, because if they did, then they would have to turn and seek God." Many spiritual seekers want a better spiritual life, want the benefits of prayer and meditation, but too often on their own terms. They, like we, want the Spirit to be a part of our life, possibly even a generous slice. But this is the problem. Prayer cannot be merely a part of our life. For to truly understand prayer and the spiritual life is to understand that it is not a portion. It is the fullness of life itself. We will never understand how to pray as long as prayer is seen as a technique that merely affirms one aspect of our lives. We will never understand the spiritual life as long as it's perceived as only a segment in the full cafeteria line of our existence. we like to think that our spiritual life can exist alongside our secular life. That we have a time for being spiritual, and a time for doing business, and a time for family, and a time for recreation. Our personal lists go on. In like manner, prayer is seen as an activity we perform at certain times of the day and week. However, Jesus destroys this idea when he proclaims, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own mother, father, wife, and children, and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." As long as we see prayer as a discrete activity, and that the spiritual life as merely one aspect of my whole being, we will continue to futilely search through thousands of books and lectures, never finding the answer. As long as we put anything else, father, mother, life, before the fullness of the spiritual life, we will never be able to find the spiritual life. Why? Because the true answer is more demanding than we want. And so we search, therefore, for an easier solution. We have been looking at the question of prayer while facing in the wrong direction. The word metanoia is a powerful word throughout the New Testament. It is that word which calls us to turn around, or as it is most often translated, repent. To turn around is to gain a new and possibly startling perspective. What is this new and, we might be bold enough to say, correct perspective? It is to see prayer not as an isolated act, but to see it and the spiritual life as one and the same. It is to understand that the spiritual life is a prayer, and that to pray is to live a life of the Spirit in the beauty of every moment. Commonly, prayer is understood as something we do. The new perspective is to see prayer as something we are. To live a spiritual life is to be a prayer. This is what Jesus taught his disciples when they came to the point of that momentous request, "Lord, teach us to pray." Let us pause and take a moment to recall that incident described to us in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew. We do not know what type of day it was. Maybe it was just a typical day in the village of Bethany. Jesus and his disciples had earlier been invited to dine at the house of Martha and Mary. It was a time of mixed emotions and a moment of mixed sentiments. There was a sense of awe in the air, a sense of something important happening, something that one could not quite put a finger on, yet was portentous all the same. There was also an ambiance of anxiety, with Martha attempting to prepare a proper meal for her guests. In the mix of awe and anxiety, we find Jesus calmly talking and teaching. Most of us are familiar with the story of how Martha, in her uneasiness to be socially appropriate, gets angry with her sister Mary for bathing herself in the atmosphere of awe. And then how Jesus gently reprimands Martha by telling her that Mary has chosen the good portion in life, as she hangs upon the words and presence of God. We are not told how the scene ends, but rather we later find Jesus outside, revitalizing his own inner life as he is praying. We can almost see him kneeling on the rough earth, his eyes closed, his inner eyes now open to heaven, and a calmness surrounding his very being, a calmness enveloping the environment about him. Even the disciples who also had endured the earlier tension of the home must have felt the restoring calm as they watched him. For out of this moment, one of them had either the courage or the eagerness to ask that vital question. Lord, teach us to pray, as John taught his disciples. Jesus, having arisen from his position, probably looked at him and then all of them, and he began. When you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. A familiar image would have immediately arisen in their minds. They would have recalled the many times that they had seen the important men of the synagogue and villages dressed in their best garb, hands raised to heaven, calling upon God in the most pious tones, appearing very devout and important to many, but leaving the soul with a sense of inner emptiness, an emptiness which leaves our souls with a sense of doubt and meaninglessness. When Jesus speaks like this, it then resonates with that secret knowledge of the soul that such prayer is actually empty. But if that is not the way to pray, then how? Gratefully, Jesus would begin to answer. And when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Very good, they might have said. So I will not pray in a manner for others to admire me or think of how spiritual or pious I am. I will do it only for God's approval. They might have thought, good, now I've got the attitude. But now, what then am I to say? What am I to actually do with this attitude? What is it that you were just doing, Master? Is there some special phrase to utter, a secret word to say? Is there a special image, a secret thought to ponder when I pray? Well, Jesus would continue. And in praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. With this, each of them could certainly recollect a scene about which Jesus was speaking. One could recall seeing certain foreigners speaking of going to the ceremonies where alcohol and other intoxicants were imbibed to bring upon themselves an ecstasy by which they hoped the gods would communicate. They would all recall the stories of the scriptures where Elijah would confront the priests of Baal, dancing and cutting themselves as they shouted to the skies for their god to act. Another could possibly see a man, as he remembered, sitting in a street, cross-legged, meditating upon some indiscernible image. And still another would wonder about friends that he knew and that had entered the secret societies in the mountains, where they would learn the special ways to meditate, secret knowledge that they were told would then lead them to enlightenment. All of these thoughts may have sparked an interest, maybe even a little envy, for these Gentiles actually seemed to have more techniques and knowledge about the spiritual life than they had. However, Jesus says to them, these techniques and all these secret knowledges that seem so spiritual, do not follow their example. Why? Because all these methods attest to the false principle that prayer is a special part, and therefore only a segment of one's full life. Jesus wishes to take his followers in a totally different direction. He was to exclaim that prayer is not a technique, not a program or a method. It is not a means to ecstasy. It is not a way of getting in touch with or moving God to act only when you need him. It is not a manner of gaining a special gift, an arcane knowledge of a special world. This may be how the Gentile had seen it, but as long as it is seen as such, then we will need a plethora of teachings and books. Jesus wishes to disavow the concept that prayer is a technique in favor of a new thinking, of a new wine. Prayer is the spiritual life. At this point, we again need to overcome another obstacle. Prayer is understood even more today as a technique than it may have been in ancient times. That may be because of our overdeveloped materialistic and scientific outlook on existence. We have come to see reality in terms of the material. We call real only what is manifested in the outer world. Jesus came with a different perspective. He came to show us that reality is first and foremost encountered in what we call the inner world of the soul. That we have forgotten this reality being the inner world is best illustrated in the modern tendency to translate Jesus' acclamation, "The kingdom of heaven is within you," as "the kingdom of heaven is amongst you." The Greek word in question is rightly translated in either manner. Yet in our materialistic age, our bias is toward the outer, amongst, where in the apostolic age and in the time of the early church fathers, even up to the time of the King James translation, it was understood in the manner closer to Jesus' teachings, as an inner reality. For us to grasp Jesus' teaching on prayer, we must also comprehend that we understand the inner life of the soul. Without this understanding, we become only outer directed, very extroverted, and we offer opportunity for literalism and concretization on both sides of our arguments. Scientific and intellectual rationalists bewail the fact that religious fundamentalists take the scriptures too literally. However, the problem is not of literal versus allegorical or cultural, but rather the problem is of inner versus outer. On this, The religious fundamentalist and the scientific rationalist unwittingly agree. Both of these argue from a point of understanding the spiritual life and prayer from an outer orientation. They merely disagree on how one should look at this outer reality. Jesus takes us in a different direction. It will only be by understanding that the kingdom of God is within you that you can approach an understanding of how to live this inner life of prayer and of the Spirit. We must conceive of the individual as comprised of a vast inner world of which the ego, that sense of our present identity, and therefore our present level of consciousness, is only a small part. When we do such, then we can begin to understand the spiritual life and prayer. We need to understand that who we are is so much more than the limitations enforced and engendered by an identity in the ego. We are made in the image of God, and our essential nature is as just this image. The ego is merely the center of consciousness. It is not our whole self, but it likes to think of itself as all there is, and that everything is relative to it. What we are called now to understand is that we are spirit, made in the image of God, as spirit with a body and a soul, a spirit with an ego, and that the ego is relative to the spirit, the essence of who we are. We are to once again turn around and take the new wine perspective that we are not bodies with souls and spirits, but spirits with bodies and souls. I like to imagine it in this way. It is as if we are the ocean. The ego then is a small fish in this ocean. And our minds and all of that brilliant rationality are merely like the brain of the fish. The fish and its brain are quite important, as rational thought is very useful and important. But certainly it is not as grand as the ocean. However, the fish likes to conceive of the ocean as its ocean, that the waters around it are all relative to it, possibly even created by it. Humility will demand otherwise. Humility allows the fish to realize that the ocean is not a part of it, the fish, but that the fish is a part of the ocean. And when this happens, the fish, the ego, takes the inner life, the life of the remainder of the ocean, finally seriously, as the most important and real aspect of life. This image of the fish in the ocean and the ego in the true self is one which will assist us in our further understanding of the life of prayer. With this word picture, we can lay hold of a simpler understanding of our lives. The ocean is our true self. It is the image of God in which we were created. It is this true self which knew and intimately encountered God from the very beginning. The ego was always to be a part of this system, but only a part, not to consider itself as the whole. When we think of ourselves as an I, a this is me, we are identifying with the fish. In the beginning and in the end, our identity is to be with the ocean. There are also a multitude of other fish in the ocean. These are the other voices in our head, the conflicting parts of the fullness of our lives. The ego is a very important fish in this picture because even though it is not the center of the true self, it is the center of consciousness. It is like a flashlight in a dark room. If we look at all of this in another manner, we can imagine that for a number of reasons, all tied to what theology calls the fall, our ocean has become rather dark and obscure. As a matter of practical experience, it is essentially unseen. And so we, especially as we identify with the fish, we call it the unconscious. Because it is unseen and the ego is seen, we identify with the ego and from that vantage point talk about our unconscious as if it is in some manner belongs to the ego. A great deal of today's psychological theories are based upon this limiting thought that the ego is central and the unconscious in some manner either belongs to the ego or is actually even produced by the ego. This is essentially saying that the ocean belongs to this fish in it, rather than the fish is merely a creature of the ocean. What we can see from our new spiritual perspective is that God created this metaphorical ocean with its fish in it. Our problem has been that this true self, this image of God, that was supposed to be lit up to fullness, became darkness, leaving only a speck of light shining. The speck of light we know as our identity, the ego. And that speck of light, unaware of the vastness of life of the soul around it, has taken the flashlight of awareness and turned it only upon itself. It is like a person in that dark room who has forgotten to explore the remainder of the room, but only turns it on its own face and becomes satisfied that illuminating my own face is quite good enough. But as one who takes a flashlight and shines it in their face, they become quite blind to all that is around them. Is it then any wonder that we are all so neurotic and narcissistic? Jesus, in his call to a transformed life, asks the ego to return to its created role, to turn the light once again outward into the soul, into the unconscious. It is why throughout the Gospels, especially the Gospel according to Matthew, Jesus is constantly calling his hearers to wake up, to stay alert, to be aware, to become conscious. Using a third picture, we can understand that God created each of us as a full, true self in his own image. As he is a multiplicity in unity, a three in one, so too is our true self a multiplicity in unity. We have a multitude of fish populating our ocean, our self. We are to be seeing ourselves in this third picture. That with this third picture we can see that this population of fish can be seen as a gigantic committee, where the ego is called to be the chair of that committee. The ego is to now shine its light on the various members of the committee, getting to know and to understand the various desires and thoughts, impulses and motivations each of them may bring to the whole. And then, by so doing, bringing all of these to the whole to become into some sort of consensus of truth. It is what Jesus may have been getting at when he calls us to be perfect, even as the Father in heaven is perfect. Or, as the word may be better translated, to come into complete harmony. For the word perfect used in the New Testament is, in many ways, the equivalent of the Hebrew word shalom. Shalom, that peace which means harmony. We are to be these harmonious wholes. The ego's role, to be conscious of all that is within the soul, and then to moderate it to a place of saying, can we work as one? The ego's role is to be the chair of the committee, or, if you will, the conductor of a vast choir. Not attempting to produce a monotonous monotone, but a harmonious resonance of inner voices. So the ego is to take its flashlight of consciousness and shine it into the ocean of the soul. And as it does so, the inner life is painted with the light of consciousness until the soul is illuminated with light. As we are about to see, this is the foundation of prayer. God never stopped relating intimately to the true self. But the ego, at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, turned the light on itself and lost its relationship to God. God speaks to the true self still. His voice and presence is throughout the ocean. As the Psalms say, deep speaks unto deep. But even today, the ego demands that God speak to it, a thing he rarely does, because he wants us to become our true selves, not to stay stuck as egos. If we are going to truly be in communion with God, to truly pray, if we are going to truly be a prayer, we need to adopt this new perspective. The new wine is to be drunk. God, knowing that this change in perspective is needed, that true metanoia is also beyond our grasp, assists with his own energy we call grace. The ego now merely needs to accept that this is the truth it needs to believe, and then to still itself, to be still and know that I am God, and so to look within with the attitude that it is only a small part of the whole of each of us that God has created. This is the ego's attitude of humility. When it does this, the beginning of full healing, of salvation, can begin. It is the simplicity now of Jesus' teaching. What does it take to be healed, to be saved? It is to believe on him God has sent.